Welcome. We have Carly with us today to talk to us about Deuteronomy. Carly, when many of us think of Deuteronomy, we think of laws, a collection of laws. Is this accurate?
Well, yes and no. So it is certainly a book that contains a lot of laws. The core of the book, between chapters about 12 and 26, is comprised of a huge number of thou shalts and thou shalt nots, and if this happens, then that should happen. What we would conventionally think of as straightforward legal material. But that's by no means the entirety of the book. So in the first 11 chapters, we have a series of speeches, exhortative material, so persuasive material, which is kind of the run-up to, before we get to the laws, trying to make the case for why the audience should follow those laws. So a very argumentative, persuasive kind of rhetorical exercise in the first 11 chapters. And then at the end of the book, we have curses, threatening bad things as well as blessings, promising good things if you obey the law as opposed to disobey the law, some poetic material, so again, some narrative material, accounting for what happens after this, because the entire book is presented as really the final last will and testament, if you like, of Moses, just before the people are brought over the Jordan into the Promised Land. This is kind of the last exhortative speech that Moses makes to the people about the behavior that they're supposed to follow and the way that they're supposed to live once they enter the land.
Okay, so more variation than just laws. So what are the major ideas happening in this book?
Okay, so perhaps the two major things which Deuteronomy is really known for is its emphasis on the exclusive worship of the one God, Yahweh. So the idea that the Israelites must not and cannot worship any other God. Before this, we certainly see in many texts throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible hints, even outright statements, that often Israelites are engaged in worshiping other gods. And Deuteronomy really takes it as one of its two major priorities to emphasize that the Israelites really must only worship their one God. The second thing that Deuteronomy is really focused on is the idea of a centralized single cult site. So again, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, we have lots of witnesses to the idea that you could worship, even if you're going to worship Yahweh, that you could worship Yahweh at a lot of different kinds of places. So small local shrines, small altars. The patriarchs are regularly seen, for example, to be setting up shrines and altars in all kinds of different places. And Deuteronomy is absolutely emphatic that all of those local sites are not allowed. They are no longer or not acceptable ways of worshiping Yahweh. You can only worship Yahweh at a single centralized cultic site. Now, the text itself never says where this one site's supposed to be, okay. And so there's some uncertainty over whether this originally had a specific site in mind, and if so, which one was it? Certainly, in the history of the tradition, it's interpreted as Jerusalem, that the single cult site, eventually the temple, is the site in Jerusalem. And we see then, as we follow the narrative, once we get into the land through, especially once we get to the books of Kings, that the kings are judged on the basis of whether or not they advocate the exclusive worship of Yahweh and whether or not they get rid of all of these other cult sites and focus the Yahwistic cult specifically on Jerusalem.
When was Deuteronomy written?
Oh, that is a whole kettle of fish all of its own. If we could agree on this, then one of the major disagreements in Hebrew Bible scholarship would be resolved. I think perhaps the short answer is that it's written at a lot of different times. So Deuteronomy very clearly shows evidence of a long process of development and editing and re-editing and re-editing and re-editing. So Deuteronomy really isn't written at any one single time. It's written over a long period of time, with each generation adding to it, altering it, and developing the tradition. So the sort of main question when people talk about, when is Deuteronomy written, probably usually what they mean is there a version of it which exists prior to the exile, or does it really just develop as an exilic or later book? And there are a whole number of different arguments involved in trying to determine whether or not some form of Deuteronomy might exist prior to the exile. One of the perhaps more famous ones is the suggestion that its form resembles certain ancient Near Eastern treaties, vassal oaths, loyalty oaths, and that Deuteronomy might have been modeled on that, and that perhaps if that's then a pre-exilic form, then perhaps that suggests that Deuteronomy might be a pre-exilic text. I made an argument elsewhere that suggests that those connections aren't really close enough to base an argument for a pre-exilic Deuteronomy on those similarities. But I might argue instead that Deuteronomy's particular interests, or parts of Deuteronomy's particular interests, suggest that some form of it exists in the pre-exilic period. Now, in the book in which we have it, clearly a lot of, especially the introductory material and some of the concluding material, is clearly interested in the exilic and post-exilic contexts. But in my opinion, a lot of the interests, particularly to do with identity and the way that Deuteronomy articulates Israelite identity in the core material and the laws, suggests a context in the pre-exilic period.
So Deuteronomy sounds like a complex book to study. Are there ways that we can approach it which make the task a little easier?
Well, so there's a number of different ways we can approach the Book of Deuteronomy, and different scholars try and tackle it from different angles. One way that we can look at it is, I already mentioned, so in the context of ancient Near Eastern materials, so this idea of Deuteronomy expecting loyalty from the Israelites to Yahweh, and the appearance of curses and blessings. Those kinds of ideas, those kinds of genres appear in other ancient Near Eastern texts. And so that is one way to try and get at the Book of Deuteronomy. We can also, within the biblical texts, we can compare Deuteronomy to the Book of Exodus. So the covenant code in Exodus is a major source for a lot of the laws in Deuteronomy. And it very clearly is using those laws and sometimes developing, altering, sometimes actually turning completely on their head some of those laws in Exodus for its own particular interests and agendas. So we have kind of an internal biblical dialogue as a way of understanding what Deuteronomy is doing. And if then we want to go even wider, we can use a number of other types of approaches, such as, for example, anthropology, to try and understand what's going on in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy, I mentioned, is particularly interested in Israelite identity. So anthropological studies of identity, of ethnic identity, of the kinds of ways in which ethnic identity is expressed and the kinds of issues it focuses on, and the kinds of contexts in which identity develops and is particularly prominent, is another way of approaching the Book of Deuteronomy and trying to understand what it is interested in and trying to achieve.
Carly, thank you.